Hi, and welcome to Wildlife 201, Advanced Vertebrate Wildlife. I am Ana Pauline Odigia. You may just call me Mampao, and I am your lecturer for this graduate course. I am a professor of zoology at the Animal Biology Division in the Institute of Biological Sciences. I graduated with BS Zoology and MS Wildlife Studies degrees from UP Los Baños and obtained my PhD in Environmental Resources from Hokkaido University in Sapporo, Japan. Wildlife 201 is a 3-unit course with 3 hours of laboratory and 2 hours of lecture every week. The prerequisite is Wildlife 101 or COI. The course will focus on Philippine amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals, their classification and diagnostic features, standard and advanced field and laboratory methods, and threats to wildlife and conservation strategies. At the end of the course, the students should be able to integrate information on the diversity, distribution, population, and aspects of systematics on the current conservation status of Philippine vertebrate wildlife. Apply new techniques for vertebrate wildlife data gathering and research, and analyze issues and problems on Philippine vertebrate wildlife. For the course outline, the first topic is on Philippine vertebrate wildlife. We will review Philippine wildlife, their diversity, distribution, population aspects of systematics, and conservation status, and also review of the zoological nomenclature. Topic 2 is on the field and laboratory methods in wildlife biology. First will be the habitat types and vertebrate wildlife diversity analysis. The second will be field data collection techniques. C is on museum curatorship, and D will be on molecular methods. The third topic will be on the phylogenetic relationships of terrestrial vertebrates. We will discuss the species concepts, the basis for establishing phylogenetic relationships, revisions in taxonomic identification and classification, and the functional adaptation and evolution of vertebrate wildlife. The fourth topic is on vertebrate wildlife issues. A is on the environment and conservation. B is on the problems and strategies. C is on the socio-economic concerns. And the last will be on governance, policies, regulations, and implementation. Wildlife 201 will be delivered through Google Classroom asynchronously. That means that although our schedule is 10 to 12 Mondays, you can access the video lectures and learning activities anytime. You just need to log in using your UP email address to join our classroom with the code ZP3EJ60. Weekly study guides will be uploaded there every Monday, 8 a.m. Your learning outputs will be due Fridays, 5 p.m. For the online course materials, video lectures and study guides will be posted in our Google Classroom page. I guess you are familiar with Google Classroom. You will also need to do searches for journal articles or access specific references and videos as indicated in the study guides. Printed course materials will be sent for those with no internet connection. However, you have to log on to the internet a few times a month for Zoom meetings. For your personal learning materials, you will need to access video lectures, scientific journals, and some videos. Additionally, please download some useful apps on your smartphone and or computer if you do not have this yet, like Zoom video conferencing app, any PDF reader apps such as Adobe, Acrobat, Reader or Foxit Reader and any presentation app such as Microsoft PowerPoint or Google Slides. For the course requirements, the 2 long exams will comprise 40% of your lecture grade. Assignments and participation in discussion forum will comprise 30% of your lecture grade, and then reports and research paper will comprise 30% of your lecture grade. The assignments may be in the form of a critique, creative work, a one-page report, or simply just submitting the answers to the study questions. Creative outputs are limited to posters or videos that tackle the discussion topic or answers to the discussion question. Reports and research paper, there will be online reporting or presentation of your research paper via Zoom. You will choose your topic for your research paper. This will mainly be a literature review for a particular wildlife species, group of wildlife species, or wildlife species of a particular locality. House rules: observe proper etiquette and netiquette. I guess you are already familiar with remote learning. Use respectful language when posting and participating in online discussions. And just like in long-distance relationships, we have to work on trust. Let's maintain a healthy teacher-student relationship as well as with your peers. We now start with the first lecture on Philippine vertebrate wildlife, in particular, diversity and conservation. So what is biodiversity? Of course, it refers to the variety of life or living things. It refers to animals, comprising of vertebrates and invertebrates, plants, bacteria, fungi, and all other living forms. For the levels of biodiversity, we are familiar with the species, but there are also the genetic diversity and the ecosystem diversity. So the Philippines is one of the 17 mega diverse countries. The country is archipelagic, and except for Palawan, most of the Philippine islands are oceanic islands. The Philippines is also mountainous, so it has a rugged terrain, and originally mainly forested, and consists of the tropical rainforest, which contributes, or which is the reason for its high level of diversity and endemism. The Philippines is said to be an archipelago within an archipelago. It is divided into faunal regions or Pleistocene aggregate island complexes or PAICs, which were formed during the last Great Ice Age when sea level was lower by 120 meters. So previously unconnected islands were connected during this time. And so these are the PAICs, the Greater Luzon, Mindoro, Greater Palawan, Greater Negros Panay, Greater Mindanao, and the Greater Sulu Pleistocene aggregate island complexes. Some Philippine wildlife species may be distributed throughout the Philippine Islands, like the Philippine cockatoo, or limited only to certain PAICs, like the Philippine eagle found in the Greater Luzon and Greater Mindanao. There are species that are polytypic. So the Philippine hanging parrot, Loriculus philippensis, is distributed throughout the Philippines. However, there are several subspecies. So as you can see, their appearances are different. Take a look at the bill, or the color of the beak, the color of the legs and the feet, the color of the tail, the color of the forehead. So these are unique to a single island or group of islands. And they are separated based on the size, the bill, and the feet color, and the plumage patterns. Although generally, the Loriculus philippensis is color green, and then you will see some red. As I have mentioned before, the Philippines is mountainous. And these mountains have different forest types at different altitudes. So this is an example of a mountain, Mount Hamigitan, found in Mindanao, showing the altitudinal distribution of, in the lower region, the lowland evergreen forest, the montane forest or the lower montane forest, the mossy forest or the upper montane forest, and a unique kind of forest, the pygmy forest. So these differences in the types of vegetation also contribute to the different kinds of Philippine wildlife species that can be found. In terms of amphibian diversity, the amphibians in the Philippines consist of frogs, toads, and caecilians. There are approximately 116 species in the Philippines, many recently described, especially the platymantis group, and more await discovery. Non-known endemic genera, 22 are native and 1 is introduced. Species endemicity is exceptionally high at 80%. The peak of amphibian diversity in the Philippines is at the montane forests. Frog families with greatest diversity exhibit also the greatest diversity of reproductive modes. Like all other groups, species diversity is driven by habitat heterogeneity, and in particular, the microhabitat heterogeneity. And of course, if the area is intact, the larger the area, the more diverse species can be supported. So what are the threats to Philippine amphibians? Anthropogenic activities like large-scale destruction of lowland forests, conversion of montane forests to large-scale agricultural plantations, and siltation of mountain streams and rivers are the primary threat to Philippine amphibians. Diseases also, like the chytridiomycosis, is a threat. This causes mass mortalities and may be due to introduced pathogens associated with climate change. Chytridiomycosis is an infectious disease in amphibians caused by the fungus Batrachochytrium dendrobatidis. Excessive shedding of skin is seen in most frog species affected by this fungus. The most typical symptom is thickening of the skin, which leads to death because they cannot take in the proper nutrients, release toxins, or in some cases, breathe. Amphibians are also sensitive to pollution, especially those coming from mine tailings, pesticides, and herbicide runoff that pollute waterways. Overhunting also, especially of the edible frogs, is a threat to amphibians. Introduction of alien and invasive species also pose a threat to our native and endemic amphibian species. So you are already familiar with Rhinella marina, and this was intentionally introduced in the Philippines to control the cane beetles in Negros. On the upper right is Hoplobatrachus chinensis. So this was also introduced in the Philippines as a source of protein. So as food. On the lower right is Rana erythrea. You are familiar with this, the common pond frog. And to the left is Calula pulchra. Now, the introduction of these two species in the Philippines is unknown. But they pose a threat to our native and endemic species through competition with available resources, and they might also bring in or introduce diseases to our native and endemic species. In terms of reptile diversity, there are 19 families represented by at least 85 genera. There's approximately 367 species of reptiles in the Philippines, consisting of crocodiles with 2 species in a single family, turtles with 14 species in 4 families. The highest are the lizards with 191 species in 5 families, followed by snakes with 160 species in 8 families. Interest in reptiles is fairly recent when you compare them with, for example, birds and mammals. Most species occur in the lowland, but newly discovered species have been found in the montane regions. Now, reptiles are known to be cryptic or secretive species. Some are dangerous or venomous. And identification is quite difficult because we have limited field guides, and thus additional field surveys are needed. Birds are charismatic creatures, and the Philippine birds have been well studied. And depending on the author, there are differences in the number of Philippine bird species. For example, Rabor in 1986 counted 940 to 975 species. Gonzalez and Rees in 1988, 557 species. Dickinson et al. 1991, 556 species. Koller et al. 576 species. Peterson et al. 2000, 552 species. And the book I use, which is a good bird guide, Kennedy et al. 2000, lists 572 species. And when you take a look at the database, the World Bird Checklist of Avibase, and you search for the Philippines, it will give you 734 species. So there's a lot of things going on with Philippine bird taxonomy, like renaming of species, reclassifying, and we will discuss them in the succeeding topics. Compared with amphibians, reptiles, and mammals, birds are the easiest to identify. However, there are still problems with their identification. For example, there are similar species, so you have to search for distinguishing features, which are sometimes subtle, compare the size also, or look for unique behavior. Cryptic birds are always hidden and hard to see, and often not as vocal as the other birds. There are also congeners, which are closely related or belonging to the same genus. There are also island and mountain variations. So the races may show striking differences in color and call, or they may not. Philippine birds may be classified according to their residency status. Endemic birds are only found in the Philippines. Near endemic birds are mainly found in the Philippines and in nearby islands which politically do not belong to the Philippines. Resident birds are naturally found in the Philippines, but they are also present in other countries. Migratory birds come to the Philippines from September to March to escape the harsh winter conditions in their country of origin. Some migratory birds breed in the Philippines and are referred to as migratory with resident populations. There are also a few introduced bird species. Like other vertebrate groups, in intact habitats, the larger the area, the more diverse species can be supported since this is driven by habitat heterogeneity. The peak of diversity is within the lowland evergreen forests. This forest type exhibits vertical stratification from understory, subcanopy, and canopy levels. Our study in Mount Makiling has shown that species richness increases from understory to subcanopy, then decreases in the canopy. Deforestation leads to habitat destruction and fragmentation, which is also the primary threat to birds. They are also hunted for food and for the pet trade. They are also threatened by environmental pollution, especially the water birds, which you may have seen to have died from entanglement or ingestion of wastes, especially plastics. They are also threatened by diseases such as avian flu and avian malaria. Feral cats have also been identified as invasive species, which have caused serious bird population declines due to predation. There are about 231 mammalian species in the Philippines, represented by 11 orders: Eulipotyphla, Pholidota, Scandentia, Dermoptera, Chiroptera, Primates, Rodentia, Carnivora, Artiodactyla, Cetacea, and Sirenia. And there are about 203 terrestrial species. Early studies have shown that mammalian diversity is influenced by elevation. For small non-volant mammals, diversity is up to the transition from montane to mossy forest or at intermediate elevations. However, habitat disturbance affects distribution and diversity, especially of small non-volant mammals, since there are species that are sensitive to and species that are tolerant of habitat disturbances. Thus, structural complexities of intact habitats positively affect diversity. Our study in Mount Makiling showed that there are differences in stratification seen in bats, wherein insectivorous bats decreased the higher the forest strata, while frugivorous bats increased the higher the forest strata. For non-volant mammals, which were generally omnivorous, habitat use was restricted to the subcanopy to canopy layers. Mammals in general are also threatened by the same factors as in other vertebrate groups. So what are the threats to Philippine biodiversity or Philippine wildlife? Habitat loss, destruction, and fragmentation remains the primary threat to Philippine wildlife. Overhunting, invasive species introduce diseases and compete with resources. Thus, they may altogether displace our native species. So shown there is the introduced species Finlayson's squirrel. Diseases weaken the immune system of wildlife species, which may lead to fatalities and thus ecologically affect population dynamics. environmental pollution, and hybridization. Our wildlife species are protected by the Philippine Wildlife Act, or RA 9147, also known as the Wildlife Resources Conservation and Protection Act of 2001. The scope includes all wildlife species of flora and fauna in all areas, including protected areas and critical habitats, as well as exotics that are traded, cultured, maintained, and are bred in captivity or propagated in the country. We will discuss more of this in the latter part of the lecture. Thank you for listening. You may now proceed with your learning activity. Next week, we will review Philippine herpetofauna.